be discussing the Sunday papers with Dawn Neeson, former editor of the Daily Star, and journalist Benjamin Butterworth. So very good morning to both of you. It's nice to see you both. First, let's take you through the front pages of the papers. And The Observer leads with growing fears for people in Gaza after last night's speech by the Israeli Prime Minister in which he declared a second war of independence. The Times, too, focuses on those remarks by Benjamin Netanyahu. The Telegraph says Israel is sending in elite troops prepared for a long war. Israeli military chiefs are quoted on the front of the Sun on Sunday, claiming the earth shook as its troops bombarded Gaza. Here at home, the Sunday Express reports that the Prime Minister is under increasing pressure to ban what it calls extremist groups stirring up hatred at protests. The Mail on Sunday carries the splash Islamic extremists' double life as a suburban doctor is exposed, claiming the leader of a group calling for a jihad is an anti-Israel protest. At an anti-Israel protest, works as a GP under a different name. The doctor has responded via the group Hizb ut-Tahrir's website, stating that he's never hidden his name or profession. The Sunday Mirror leads with its exclusive about a government minister campaigning with suspended Tory MP Peter Bone. And the Sunday People centres on remarks made about the COVID pandemic by former Health Secretary Matt Hancock while appearing on a reality TV show. So let's bring in Dawn and Benjamin to go through some of those front pages, and an awful lot of them, once again, inevitably a focus on the Israel-Hamas war. Benjamin, you picked out the Observer's coverage to kick us off here, and they're reflecting on this televised news conference once again last night by the Israeli Prime Minister and some of his war chiefs as well, talking about a second war of independence that is now entering its new phase.
Yeah, things have really stepped up in Gaza. There's been 100 jets that have been bombing targets in there. And Netanyahu said last night, we've moved into a new phase of the war. The ground in Gaza shook tonight. And I think what all indications show is that this is not going to be a short-lived war. There's talk of this being a long war, of that being what Israel is practicing for. And I think, the politics around the world, the context in which Netanyahu and Israel are operating are getting much tougher. We saw those marches that have been happening yesterday. And I think that it's going to be very difficult for Israel because, politicians like Sunak are coming under a lot of pressure about whether to support this. And if it looks like a long war, it looks like a lot of those 2.3 million people in Gaza are going to get caught up in this when they're targeting Hamas. I think this is getting pretty messy now.
Well, yeah, and obviously Israel had a huge amount of sympathy in the aftermath of those terrible attacks on October the 7th, but there's also public sympathy for people losing their lives in Gaza as well.
This is the problem we've got now, Anna. I mean, originally the sympathy was very much with Israel when, the horrific attacks, which, there is no buts or ifs. That was just horrific, no matter which side you're on. Most of the papers today are going with sort of like Israel's ground incursion. And the sympathy is now being lost. And you have countries that were on side and were hoping to broker peace deals like Saudi Arabia and Egypt now actually backing away and going, you have to stop this. We can't condone what's happening here. And the population of Gaza is very, very young. I think 50% of them are under 18. I mean, they're a very young population.
Yeah, but I mean, you mentioned Saudi Arabia, and I think that context is important because I was in Israel in July discussing some of the economic deals that were going on in the region and the massive progress that was being made, the UAE having normal diplomatic and economic relations. And you kind of wonder whether Iran is the real actor in this with Hamas. We know that they're heavily funded by Iran, and the timing was to try and prevent that kind of progress that was happening. And so you have to have, naturally you'd have sympathy with Israel, but I can understand why, a lot of my Jewish friends, a lot of Israelis that you see on the news feel very frustrated now because there's so many bad actors in this that are trying to cause this problem. And the fact is that if there were a ceasefire, which clearly there's a certain degree of public pressure, I think polling suggests most people in this country would rather that. Actually, if you put yourself in the shoes of an Israeli, they had that horrific attack. Who's to say that won't happen again? Who's to say that this stopping tomorrow, it will save civilian lives, but will it push the can down the road?
Well, this is the problem as well. And, James cleverly literally said overnight, saying, he's resisting calls for that ceasefire, which most of the Middle East think would be a good idea.
The government's line is to call for humanitarian pauses in fighting to let aid
exactly.
in,
Yes, so get aid in, get the hostages out, because there are 229 hostages we believe still alive in there, including a 9-month-old Argentinian baby. So, I mean, you know, and as you were going back to, you know, the Israelis out there going, well, we've got family out there. What's happening with this bombardment? And the really terrifying thing about is the hospital, the Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza City, which the Israel Defense Forces are saying, well, this is a Hamas base. They've got a base underneath it, so it's a legitimate target. And that, again, if they're seen to target that with military hardware, it's going to lose even more sympathy. It's an awful mess.
Take us to the Sunday Telegraph, Dawn, because there's more detail here, isn't there? They talk about sending in elite troops for a long war. And up until now, we had seen Israel conducting these raids where they'd go in overnight,
yes,
carry out various attacks or reconnaissance and then come out again. This time the troops have stayed in, and we're getting a few more details about
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's what, you know, as the main incursion, a tiny incursion, happened on Friday night, but they've compounded that overnight, and they are now staying in the Gaza Strip, whereas they were coming out before. But they, you know, the Israeli defense minister said last night that, you know, this is, you know, by air, by land, and by sea. So it really is now. They've stopped short of calling it invasion. They're not saying we've invaded, they're saying it's an incursion. And sort of like, the problem I have with all this is, you know, we should have learned a lesson in the past. What is the end game? You know, whenever you go into a country in a war, you should have a plan to get out of it. And there doesn't seem to be one.
Well, because they say that their aims are to dismantle Hamas,
yes,
but also to save the hostages and release the hostages. But there are questions about what would happen next, because Hamas, obviously, it runs Gaza, and also it's launching these attacks on Israel. But beyond that, is it an idea as well? And do you get rid of that if you get rid of the...
I mean, the problem
functioning
with the hostages is that we know that this is an intentional tactic of war. It's an intentional tactic that has been used to launder money. Iran, for example, one of its senior ministers has said that it intentionally takes Western hostages in order to get money to fund its economy. Hamas is heavily taking advice from Iran. And so, you know, I think it would be very difficult for Israel in reality to try and meet any of these demands where Hamas says, if you stop attacking us, then we'll return the hostages. Thankfully, we've seen hostages being returned. But but the idea that would be a practical way to behave, I think, is highly dubious, because arguably that would just encourage them to take more hostages whenever there are tensions.
This is the problem, isn't it?
Yeah. Really difficult issues, and the world working out what it thinks about it. And the Sunday Express focuses on protests here. So Benjamin, what are they saying?
So there's been lots of concerns about the kind of things that have been chanted, the kind of sentiment among some, maybe a minority at these protests about the issue. And ministers have said that there's openly celebrating terrorism on the streets of Britain, of people referring to the extraordinary heroism of Hamas at these protests, and that there needs to be a clampdown on hate mobs, in the words of the Sunday Express. And I think, you know, we've all seen some of the shocking images of those women at a protest the other week that had paragliders, which, you know...
Yes, representing attackers that went to Israel.
You'd have to be naive to not think that's why they were wearing that, of people shouting jihad and police not doing anything, saying that, you know, it has multiple meanings in Islam. And I think it's very difficult, because I know that Met police officers have said in regards to this, when there's been videos of what most people would consider terrorist remarks, sympathies, of saying, well, look, when there's tens of thousands of people, a police officer going in and making an arrest for those comments can really inflame the situation on the ground. We're using intelligence afterwards to try and challenge this. But I think there's a considerable degree of frustration that remarks that, you know, if you shouted them in isolation on the street, you'd get arrested.
Yeah.
If you do it with thousands of others, you get away.
Yeah, well, you see, and there were banners, and they were handing out leaflets as well, literally backing Hamas. And, you know, when you've got Jewish people being scared on the streets of their own country, we've seen this shocking rise in anti-Semitism, you know, and you've got Jewish people scared, you know, to leave their homes, certainly if they've got one of the marches, you know, round their way where they live. And it was Birmingham yesterday was a march, wasn't there? And the problem I have with this is the police take a very soft attitude to the Hamas, the Palestine marches. But if it was like a more right-wing march, they would be arresting people left, right, and centre. I mean, they sort of arrested someone the other day.
Well, they would say they're just following the law. The laws are there, and they're trying to observe.
But they're not following the laws here because, I mean, Hamas are a terrorist group. This is supporting a terrorist group, which...
There have been some arrests made, haven't there? I think there were 9 arrests.
Only
overnight.
9.
There have, which I think is a farcically small number, right? I'm not willing to believe there were only 9 people who made comments that ought to be illegal. I think one of the problems is that I think a lot of the police on the ground, it's a complicated issue. It's thorny political. It's hard to work out what's acceptable, what some of the meanings of these chants mean. And I think police officers are ill-trained to spot some of the behaviour and what people are really saying. You know, things about from the river to the sea. I imagine there were lots of police officers a couple of weeks ago who really didn't understand what was going on in those situations.
I'm sure some of them still don't, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Anyway, lots to talk about again in the next hour, but we're out of time for now. But Benjamin and Dawn, thanks very much indeed. We'll see you in an hour. Thank you.